with a short history. We're going to do the chapter 6. We did the history of in England, and we did the history of the USA, the Baptist churches there, and today we're going to do the Baptist churches in Europe. How did they develop? In overall, as they say there in the book, you can read it on your own, go through it on your own. They said in the beginning the numbers were very small, but they were virtually in every European country in Europe. And some of them, like the Russian, Germany, Sweden, they form a significant percentage of the Protestant community in those countries. In some of the countries like Russia, Germany, and Sweden. It was a bit of a surprise to me also in Germany. I didn't know that.
Baptists.
Yeah. The man who deserves to be called the apostle of the Baptist cause in Europe was the German Johann Gerhard Unken. Okay, let me say that. At the age of 13, this Lutheran lad, he was Lutheran, was taken to Scotland by a Scottish merchant. During the following 9 years, he travelled extensively through Scotland, England, France, and Germany. And in London, at the end, they say he was led to conversion. So he received the Lord in London. So he was in the church for a long time without being converted. That reality sometimes is difficult for churches to handle, and sometimes just to acknowledge. There are so many of the members in the church who are not converted. It happens in congregations. It's difficult because it's difficult to judge. Because you don't know everything. But it seems like a reality that we need to handle more actively in congregations. Just to mention. He was in the church for a long time, in a Lutheran guy, but after a long time, quite a few years later, he was converted. At once he dedicated himself to evangelism. He was not you can say maybe he had the gift of evangelism, but at least he dedicated himself to that. In 1823, he accepted appointment by the Continental Society as missionary to Germany. So he went back to his country, working in Hamburg, studying the scriptures concerning the issue of baptism, led him to being baptized in 1834. Together with his wife and 5 others, by visiting American Baptist professor. So the professor had a profound influence on his life, looks like, and he got baptized. The small Baptist church which Onken led experienced considerable persecution. Now that's always a good sign. It's not a nice thing, but it's always a good sign for growth. But it survived and grew, so that by 1845 there were 380 Baptists in Hamburg. And I think 1845, and now we're going to Europe. That was in Hamburg, Germany. Baptist community. So it looks like that is more or less the beginning of the work in Germany. Inspired by missionary vision, and that slogan, you can write it down, I think. Every Baptist a missionary. That's the slogan. If it's not that, something is wrong in any case. Everyone needs to be a missionary. It depends also what you understand by the word missionary. every member needs to testify, needs to be a witness. He will be a witness with the Spirit. Yeah, is it a biblical thing?
Well, Paul did 3. He did missions. He had what, 3? He did how many
Yes,
missions?
but every member.
Not every member did that, no. But I mean, every member went out and just testified. I mean, that's part of it. You can't help but test. It's natural. It's something natural. It's not something that you conjure up. If you have to conjure it up, then don't do it, please.
I believe it's a biblical principle because of what you just said. Because if the Spirit of the Lord is in you, you will do what God do. And what is God doing? He is reaching out to the world. He loves the world. So that will become part of you. That is, if it's not happening, there's something wrong somewhere. That connection with God, maybe an understanding of one another. We need to work more if it's not like that. Morgan conducted preaching tours in Germany and surrounding countries of Denmark, Danie, Switzerland, the purpose of strengthening existing Baptist churches and planting new ones. 1851, there were 41 churches from a combined membership of 3,764 members. It's not the influence of one person, I believe, but he played a key role. And why? Because he said, every Baptist is missionary. So he's not the only missionary. Each converted person he motivates to be a missionary.
That is we make disciples of disciples.
Disciples of disciples. We don't know exactly the way he did it, but one thing we know, he traveled. So he went from place to place to encourage, like Paul, faith groups. So that, and yes, today in my mission work I'm also using the same principle. We're also trying to put the focus on the members and the people there doing the work, but they need sometimes encouragement and visits and walking together, crying together, praying together, looking for answers together, and then leave them to do the job because they can, in Christ they can. And believe and get people to make their mind say that I have all the potential in the world to change my community. I have it because it's not me, it's him. Even if you're blind or you whatever problem. In any case, so that is that's what we can see behind the history and what happened here. Okay, what makes church planting good and what makes it dangerous for our mission? Why is church planting sometimes dangerous?
Are we talking about church planting in a community that's already religious, or church planting in a community that's not religious at all?
Not religious, new church planting.
Or that's an upset to the community because you're introducing something completely foreign to them.
Definitely, and you will get a lot of resistance. That's true.
The church denomination can have focus instead of God. The denomination,
yes,
can
if
have a focus.
If that's your aim, if that is your call, you interpret your calling. Like if there's a lot of churches, then I've done my job. Then it's dangerous because you're not focusing on the real thing. You're not loving the people and bringing them to God. You're planting churches. You can put it that way. So it's not always like that, but I mean, you can plant churches, and I believe like in reaching the people and through them churches develop by themselves in any case. Then it's something else.
The model of church is going to determine how intrusive your evangelism is in the country. if you're going to tell people they need to build a stone building while all the other buildings in the whole country is made out of sticks, then you're going to be doing something intrusive to the community. And if you're going to tell people they all need to be baptized in swimming pools, and all they have in the country is small rivers, then you're also going to have problems.
Do you convert people, or do you allow God to convert people?
Exactly.
That's the difference.
Yes. Yes.
You don't convert people. You can get people to say yes. But if it's not God,
Yeah, I think the landmark people have the same kind of attitude that you can understand why they want to be so fundamental, but it's can be damaging to how you approach others.
paternalistic way of working out. Okay, but we will talk a lot about that in missions. Then in 1880, Onken established a theological seminary at Hamburg. And that's also a benchmark. 1880 and Unken, whatever. 80, that's also the theological school. That is also something, training is as a formational principle in any. That's why the training is always for a new place, always somewhere you need to do training. You not, people need to understand themselves. They need to study the Bible themselves, the formational principle. The number of German Baptists reached 45,000. And missions were conducted in Scandinavian countries, Holland, Poland, Switzerland, Russia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and in Africa. By the year 2000, there were more than 600 Baptist churches, can say congregations, in Germany, with a membership of 90,000. So they grew very rapidly. In Sweden began with a conversion of 2 seamen, Schroeder and Nielsen. Schroeder was baptized in New York by Onken, and Nielsen was baptized by Onken in Hamburg in 1847. And they started the first Baptist church in Sweden in 1848. That's quite late already. It's not so early, it's quite late. If you think the Reformation started in 1500, 1848, reached Sweden, the first Baptist church. Persecution forced him to Copenhagen to shepherd the Baptist church there. Again, persecution helped spread the gospel. And he was, later on, he returned to Sweden. 300 Baptist churches in Sweden later on, in 2000. And the Swedish Baptists have also been active in missions to other countries. That's the sign of a healthy church. If you are busy with your mission work in other countries, fulfilling your reason of existence is doing mission. If you're not doing mission, you are not church. That's the fact. I don't know if you agree with me, but if you're not doing missions, you are not church. So if you're fulfilling that, that's a healthier church. Norway and Denmark having about 5,000 members in about 50 churches each. Now, just for interesting sake also, if you look now at when they talk about congregation or churches, and you count how many churches and how many members, you see more or less there were only 80 for each congregation. And that gives you an idea of the character of the churches. Because if a group is very big, the character is totally different. If there's less than 100 people, immediately you're working more on relationships. So just for interest's sake, but because that's a very important thing to think of when establishing congregations and see how they grow. If you have these thousands of members in a congregation, you don't have that character of relationships. You need to find it in smaller groups, and it's very difficult to find it. I'm not giving solutions, but that is, of course, a thing that we need to think about. But in that time, they worked with a year in Europe with about 80 members in a congregation. Understanding something of how it functions, if you look at that amount of people. These factors favored the introduction of the Baptist witness to Russia. So they're busy with the mission work, so they go to Russia. And a large number of the Mennonites refugees, they came to migrate. The migration of the Mennonites refugees from military service in Prussia is one of the reasons why it went to Russia. Out of these refugees and many Russian peasants influenced by them grew the Standist movements which spread widely in Russia. I'm not sure what the Standist movement was. The majority gradually linked up with Russian Baptists. One of these pietistic Standists who eventually became a leader of the Baptists was Michael Rustushny. That's Russia. A second source was the Moroccans, a religious sect, very much like the Quakers, which came under the influence of the German Baptist named Martin Calveit in 1862. The Baptist community was built up. Basil Pavlov, now we're really Russian, emerged and leading figure. Later he and that other Rustushny met, and the two movements united eventually into the Russian Baptist Union 1884. So 1884, now we can say Russia. Actually started with the Baptist Union. The most notable Baptist conversion from the Moroccans was Ivan Proanov. He was a student of St. Petersburg, 1888. He didn't accept the rigid views of the Russian Baptist Union and formed a separate group of churches. Baptists in policy, but calling themselves evangelical. No, the Evangelical Baptist Church at the end had a great influence in the world. You find them everywhere, but that's where they started. The group grew from 8,000 members to more than 250,000 in 8 years after 1940. Evangelical Baptist Church. You see them worldwide. In Mozambique, there's a lot of Evangelical Baptist churches also today. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about numbers. How many people do you think will cross the border where it will be more structure than relational influencing people?
How do you define the difference?
It's difficult, but I hope you can find more or less the idea. It's not something that I worked out. But if you have a small group of 5, 6 people and you meet looking for the Lord, there's a lot of things happening in a small group. Very personal things. And you reach deep levels of life experiences with one another because you're a small group. If you are 50,
it gets harder.
it's a difficult one because you can influence one another personally, but not so good. You need smaller groups, and that doesn't happen within a bigger group. It's very difficult to find smaller groups in a bigger group to do the real work of influencing one another. Put it that way. So, if you go to 1,000, a church can be a very impersonal place. It's just the idea, it's not anything theological or whatever. It's just the idea, because you need people who know you so well that you influence one another somewhere. You can say, okay, families should have that, but that also needs to be discipled into people to do. It's not automatic. And if the church is impersonal, many times the families also become more impersonal instead of more intimate to one another. So it's just a question. So it seems like somewhere, if a group is growing, they need to discipline themselves to divide. Not because of differences, but because of taking accountability for one another's growth and mission work and zeal. Because in a small group you cannot hide it if you don't have zeal.
Yeah.
But in a congregation with 1,000 members, if somebody
it gets
90% don't have zeal anymore. But nobody influences one
true.
another with it. You understand what I mean? So it's just an idea that I put on the table. It's not in the books.
No. But all what I meant was that if you think that everything you do is 100% God, it's a pipe dream.
Yeah.
You're living. You must go and see somebody.
Pastor used to tell us that if he's going that side, what they used to do, they will calculate just like in 50 member per.
Yes.
Like a cell group.
And even smaller groups.
Smaller groups.
Cell groups. So they are meeting also somewhere. They say maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever they choose. So in small group, they can just do the follow up of each other. And then on Sunday, all of them they will probably come to a big church, and then they can. At least the pastor also can just go to
amazing worship in a big group. Like it's amazing worship.
I agree with you that it's about just organization to see how we can just try to oversee all.
But the big group should not be the focus.
Yes, that's what I'm saying about the
Because-
young issue. Because we're talking about 55,000, that time 55,000 cell groups. So that's what's already a lot.
And what's amazing about them is you find you walk in there, you walk into a family.
Yeah.
They have this intimate relationships with one another.
Yeah.
Any stranger coming in,
Yes.
they're accepted as family members. How are you? Who are you? Interested in you as a person. It's an amazing experience if you go and visit them.
Yeah.
How can a 55,000 membership create that intimacy? That's amazing.
Yeah.
But I mean,
It's only very good.
It happens.
And it's only very that the Holy Spirit can just.
But I think the thing is, if you put the focus on the big group,
It's a problem.
then the big group is influencing the small group. But if you put the focus on the small groups, the small groups is influencing the big group. And I think that's something that we need to think of. And that's in my head. It's not it's theories. It's not. But I think if you put the emphasis on the small groups and that small relational things that happens there and what happens there, and you can manage to do that, those groups will influence the bigger meetings. And they will also get some of that character from the small groups. But what we do in most of our denominations, we focus on the big meeting. And the big meeting is now influencing our, even our family and our small groups relationships. And that's sorry. Because we think that's a great thing that happened. The great thing is not there, it's here. The focus should be. And again, I want to say, the focus needs to be in the small group because there is more things happening between people than in the big group.
Yes.
Because in big group, you're not in the relational thing, you are in the receiving, teaching mode. You go to listen and experience the worship, but it's not interpersonal thing. It's more. In 1944, both groups in Baptist and Russian Union formed the Council of United Baptists in the Evangelical Christians. Since the collapse of communism in Russia, Christianity has experienced both revival and confusion. The pressure was on them. Now the pressure was released, the persecution, and suddenly there's confusion and revival. Because now new influences coming in, and they explain it like that. Some of the groups that were held together by the pressure of communist oppression have since split up when the oppression stopped. We don't know how many of them are there still in Russia. They don't know. One thing is for certain, the Baptists continue to exercise an important influence in the spiritual and social life in many Russian people. But that is also interesting. After the oppression was lifted, why do they experience revival? Because they are now free and they can talk, and they don't have to hide. And people started talking, and that would draw a lot of attention, and revival can break open, and that happened. But also confusion. But now, because there's immediately our corrupt nature brings a lot of other things also into the story. Because some start teaching what he thinks. Because he can now, he's free.
Yeah, it's free.
He can say whatever he likes. People like to tell people what they want to hear. And then there's a populistic thing. And if you're only working with populistic things, you will get the votes and the people, but you don't have a future. So yeah, it's interesting. The two other European countries which have been significant in Baptist growth was Romania and Hungary. Began to thrive about 1910 with Schlicht. German American visited the country at the request of American Russian Baptists, despite severe opposition. By 1930, there was about 44,000 Baptists in the country. As fascism came to dominate the government, a new era of persecution began in 1937. Yeah, you know, fascism is when there's a dictator. It's in contrast with democracy. It's a power down government, and that brought persecution also. Post-war period, Baptists experienced a greater measure of freedom, and by 1947 the number has grown to 200,000. At the end of the 20th century, there was about 1,300 Baptist churches, congregations in Romania, and 230,000 members. That's now the numbers, so you don't have to remember all of them, but get the idea of I mean, if you see 300,000, it's not always a big part of the community, but at least you get the idea. Baptist work in Hungary began through the testimony of 6 Baptist artisans. Artisans who had sought work in Hamburg in 1845, and they were converted and baptized under Untitled ministry. See again, the one believing in missionary work. He started everywhere, influenced everywhere. In 10 years, 629 men and women have been baptized. Okay, and if you look at how many members they were in a congregation, it's only 25 in each congregation. if you count the numbers there. It's only 25 in the congregation. Interesting. Despite the heroic labors of the sacrifices of many, Baptists in Europe have remained a small minority. Now that they are growing rapidly, it is probably true, however, that they have wielded a spiritual influence out of the proportion to their numbers.